I don't speak about politics much on YouTube, and that's because, just on a personal note, one of the things that I daily struggle with is what is my responsibility as a Christian in regards to navigating the political world and the culture around us. Like, that's just something that I wrestle through. I don't think there's a clear answer, and anybody who says that there is a clear answer, I think is probably minimizing things too simply. On one hand, I will say that above all, I am a Christian. I am a pastor, I'm a minister, I'm a disciple maker, and my main job in life is to be a slave to Christ Jesus and to help other people live as slaves to Christ Jesus, giving him the glory, honor, praise, and obedience that he rightfully deserves as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. On the other hand, I would say that by one definition of the term, I am a nationalist. And what I mean by that is that I love the country in which I live. I appreciate the freedoms that we have been given here in America. And I do think that it is our God given responsibility as Christians, no matter where we live, to submit to the authorities that were placed above us, recognizing that those authorities were placed there by God, insofar as those authorities do not call us to directly disobey the commandments of God, right? And so on one hand, I'm a Christian. On the other hand, I am a nationalist, but I know for a fact I am not a Christian nationalist, and what I mean by that is this. I do not think that, well, let me say this. While America was founded on many Christian principles and morals and ethics, I would not claim that America is inherently a Christian nation. Many of the founders might have been Christian, but that does not mean that it is inherently a Christian nation. On the other hand, I do not think that America represents the chosen people of God. And I do not think, as some people do, that all the promises given to Israel can for some reason be given to America. I also do not think that America is the ultimate nation of all nations, right? I think that it's a very unique nation. It's a nation in which I'm happy to be alive and to live in, and I appreciate all the freedoms given to it. But I also have studied history, and I realize that there are many people who have felt the same way about their nations, and they've thought that they are the most important nation in the whole world. But I recognize that America is a young nation, and therefore I don't want to put too much weight on this, when in reality, that's just not what Scripture would lead me to do. And I think that the dangers of Christian nationalism are something that we can't overlook, right? The idea whenever people equate their nation and serving their nation to serving God, I think that it can become a very tricky area to navigate, and I don't want to fall into that, and I want to be wary of it. That being said, I don't talk about politics much on public platforms because I would much more prefer to have conversations about politics on an individual one-on-one or just like or a communication with people that I know and love to where I can pursue those conversations and seek unity and love first and foremost. Whereas talking to y'all through this screen, it's inherently one-sided, right? I'm not getting to hear y'all until I look at the comments later on, and it's harder to have a discourse, right? And so to me, it's just easier to talk about politics somewhere else, but I do think there is a time and a place to talk about politics on a public platform, even if you're not somebody who is inherently political, and I think this is one of those cases, because today what I want to do is I want to talk about the memorial service of Charlie Kirk. Obviously, the whole Charlie Kirk stuff has been something that has been super impactful for a lot of people worldwide as a result of the last few weeks. And that's me included. I think that the reason why it's impacting me is maybe different than what I've seen most people being surprised by online, and maybe we'll talk about that later in this video. But yesterday, at the time of recording this, my wife and I sat down and we watched pretty much the entire memorial service for Charlie Kirk. And I found myself being very intrigued by what I saw, because once again, when it comes to politics, I really struggle with how to relate politics to religion in the sense of like what is our responsibility when it comes to navigating all that. And whenever I see politicians bringing up religion, I inherently have more of a skeptical approach to it, right? Whenever I hear politicians start talking about God and Jesus and stuff like that, maybe it's because I inherently kind of distrust politicians. I immediately begin to think that they're mainly doing this in order to bring in voters and to try to get people on their side. And I find it very dangerous whenever people equate their political party to their religious belief. Whenever they say, oh, because I belong to this party, I therefore belong to this religion, or because I belong to this religion, I therefore belong to this party. I think that our devotion should above all be to God, and then that should guide our politics. But in general, there's a lot of things that I am wary of and skeptical of, and I approach all of these things with a sense of skepticism. And then there's also the danger of Christian nationalism, which I've already talked about. I don't want to produce a sense of cultural Christianity where people think, oh, because I have biblical values and because I have Christian ethics and because I live in America, therefore I'm a Christian. I think that's also very dangerous. And I think that it's good for us to separate ourselves from that line of thinking. That being said, as I was watching the memorial service yesterday, I couldn't help but be impressed by what I saw. Don't get me wrong, there were some of the speakers at the service that I was still confused by, right? There were some of them where I was like, okay, you're kind of bordering that line of Christian nationalism, or you're employing biblical language to communicate very unbiblical values. But there were some of them who I was actually very impressed by. Obviously, without a doubt, the person I was most impressed by was Erica Kirk, the wife of Charlie Kirk. I might do a whole other video talking about her in the future, because I just loved her speech beginning to end, and I kind of think that it should almost be like a mandatory listening for all Christians to see how you should respond in public to the face of tragedy. Beautiful. But today, I actually want to talk about what is probably going to be the most controversial message that was preached, or maybe not preached, the most controversial message that was shared at this memorial service, and that was the message, the eulogy, the 42-minute long eulogy, shared by Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States. I don't think anybody could look at the president and say that his relationship to the faith is a simple one. Because on one hand, he does speak about Christianity positively. He does, in some sense, promote biblical values. Whether he embodies those biblical values is a total matter altogether. And I think it's very easy to criticize him whenever he's in the public living in ways that seem contrary to the gospel, when I think that we also in private sometimes live that way as well. But to me, it's very interesting, right? Because on one hand, like I will admit, just readily, whenever I see the president talking about Christianity, I think in general, I do have that air of skepticism about it, to where it does seem to me that he is usually just trying to appeal to a demographic, and he's trying to get the evangelical vote or something along those lines. That being said, there was some things in his speech that did stick out to me quite a bit. And so what I want to do in this video is I want to go through his speech. I don't want to look at all of it because that would just take way too long, and we'd be here for several hours, and I don't have time for that. You don't have time for that. But there are certain clips from his speech that I just want to highlight. I want to reflect on a little bit, because I genuinely found myself being very impressed by what the president was doing. And keep in mind, all these speeches are very intentionally laid out, and everything he said was intentional. And so you can't divorce what he's saying from the political agenda that might have motivated it. But to me, it just rang as a very authentic message coming from this guy who was trying to honor somebody who was super influential to his campaign. So regardless of what your opinion is in regards to Donald Trump and Christianity, I don't seek to answer that question in this video. Instead, I want to reflect today on the words that he said about Charlie and what that message communicated, because I genuinely found it very impressive and actually kind of touching. And again, I don't really know what the end of this video is going to look like, but I just wanted to share those thoughts with you to see if maybe we could talk about it some more, because I just found it fascinating. And so, that being said, my name's David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. I'm going to cut to our little intro, and then we are going to start looking at some different clips from Donald Trump's message for Charlie Kirk.
Less than 2 weeks ago, our country was robbed of one of the brightest lights of our times, a giant of his generation, and above all, a devoted husband, father, son, Christian, and patriot. Charles James Kirk was heinously murdered by a radicalized, cold-blooded monster for speaking the truth that was in his heart. He was violently killed because he spoke for freedom and justice, for God and country, for reason and for common sense. He was assassinated because he lived bravely, he led boldly, and he argued brilliantly without apology. He did what was right for our nation. And so on that terrible day, September 10th, 2025, our greatest evangelist for American liberty became immortal. He's a martyr now for American freedom. I know I speak for everyone here today when I say that none of us will ever forget Charlie Kirk, and neither now will history.
All right, so that's the only clip I'm going to share from the very beginning of this message, because Trump being Trump, he ends up going into a lot of more political stuff than I think was ultimately necessary for the message that he was sharing. But the reason I want to share that clip is because right off the bat, he kind of sets the mood for what the rest of this is going to be. On one hand, the emphasis is on just remembering Charlie and talking about what a great and amazing man he was. And that's how any eulogy should be, right? Whenever you share a eulogy, your goal is to honor and memorialize the person who has passed. And in that way, you can just see that Trump, he's a good speaker, right? And whoever wrote the speech, I don't know if it was him, I don't know if it was one of the people in his cabinet, I have no idea who wrote the speech. But ultimately, whoever did, they're doing a good job, right? They are doing what a eulogy is meant to do, and Trump is delivering it positively. At the same time, I want you to notice how in the midst of all of this, he does do the thing that Donald Trump also regularly does, and he does begin to almost draw a little line of divide, right? And whenever he's describing the guy who assassinated Charlie, he describes him in very polarizing terms, like a radical leftist, all this stuff. And most people would be very quick to dismiss Trump as just being Trump and he's just being extreme on purpose. And I would say that he is being Trump and he is being extreme on purpose. But what we're going to see later on in the speech, and that's really the thing that stuck out to me the most as I was watching this yesterday, is that the reason why Trump is doing this is different in this case, to me it seems, than it is whenever he speaks polarizing ways to like news outlets and stuff like that. Oftentimes, like we know that Trump, he is a polarizing figure, right? He is one of the most controversial figures to have ever lived. And we're just living and we're watching all this, right? But typically, whenever he speaks controversially, it is usually to put attention on himself and stuff like that. But what we're going to see over the course of this eulogy is that Trump will use very radical language. But the reason he ultimately ends up doing that is in order to contrast himself with Charlie. And to me, the reason why this stuck out to me is because to me, this is the greatest compliment that the president could give to this man. Because obviously, Charlie Kirk was not a president. Could he have been the president one day? Maybe, right? It seems like he was perfectly on that path to have done it. We'll never be able to see that because he's been taken away from us, right? But Charlie Kirk was not the president, and he technically wasn't even a politician, but he was a political advocate who was very influential. And so it's kind of hard whenever a president shows up to deliver a eulogy for a person, you have to ask, what could this man possibly say to honor somebody? I mean, like obviously the president's presence there is in and of itself an honor, right? Most people are not going to have the president of the United States sharing a eulogy for them. But you have to ask, what could this person honestly say that wouldn't just sound like empty words, right? Because obviously, had Charlie ended up at the level of like the president? No, he was just a person going from college campuses and he was being very influential, but he was not the leader of the free world, right? He was in a different position. And so what Trump is going to do throughout his speech is he is going to basically be throwing himself under the bus again and again and again. He's going to employ radical language, but he's doing that in order to highlight the thing that sets him and Charlie apart from one another. He presents himself as somebody who can at sometimes be petty, and at sometimes can be hateful, and at sometimes can be very radical. And he contrasts that with Charlie, who he lifts up as the epitome of Christian virtue. And to me, that is one of the greatest compliments that the president could give, because one thing that we can say, whether you support President Trump or not, everybody can agree that he is a proud individual, right? He's a businessman, he's a politician. It's hard to get into those realms without being proud. And Trump would admit that he's a proud person. But throughout the speech, what he's going to do is he is going to be humbling himself in order to exalt his friend. And to me, I think that's what was moving me so much, because I was like, there's very few times where I have seen Trump speak where he willingly degrades himself in order to elevate somebody else. Yet that's what he does again and again throughout the speech. And to me, that's just very interesting, right? Because to me, it takes away the political agenda and it allows him to honestly just give a very touching tribute to his friend. And so even at the beginning, he's saying, we're here to remember Charlie, but then he begins speaking about the other side as this very radical leftist thing. And he's going to come back to that later on in order to throw himself under the bus. So I just want to highlight that because I found that very interesting. But let's move on a little bit. We're going to jump forward ahead in the speech.
But Charlie would often call me, sometimes the night before a big event, the other side of the country. And he'd ask me, he'd say, do you think you could come and speak at the event? The following day, right? I'd say, Charlie, give me I'm the president of the United States. You want me to travel 4 hours by plane? And you know, sometimes I did it. He was a very good guy. He was a very convincing guy. He didn't stop, but he would ask for things like that. Sir, could you be tomorrow in California? I said, Charlie, give me a break, please. He just wouldn't stop, and he succeeded. But I almost always went because you never wanted to let Charlie down. He worked so hard. You just didn't want to let him down. I felt guilty. He'd make me feel very guilty. As president, many people asked me for things, but Charlie was one of the few who always gave more than he took. He was a giver, much more than a taker.
Okay, so again, he's doing the same exact thing here, where he is trying to elevate Charlie and kind of put himself down a little bit. And to me, again, this is intriguing. Most of this video is just going to be me analyzing this from a rhetorical perspective. Don't worry, later on we will get into more of my thoughts about the intersection of politics and religion and stuff like that. But for right now, I just want you to notice, rhetorically speaking, what Trump is doing, right? On one hand, he's emphasizing the sort of friendship and camaraderie that him and Charlie had. Now, did Charlie actually have the president on speed dial? I have no idea, right? I don't know what their actual relationship was like. I know that they knew each other for a long time. I know that Charlie was super influential in getting Trump elected. He literally wrote a book called the Make America Great Again doctrine, right? So Trump and Charlie definitely were, they were companions, right? They were friends. I mean, were they friendly on the level of just hey, let me call up the president? I don't know, right? I heavily doubt that. I don't know if anybody can really just do that, but I could be wrong. But at the very least, that is how Trump is characterizing it. And again, you have to realize that all of this must be read in light of the fact that Donald Trump is well known as being a very boastful and proud individual. And again, I'm not saying that just to harp on Trump. I'm saying that this is the image that he has chosen to curate, and he willfully does it, and he would admit to doing it, right? So this is not a criticism. This is his tactical strategy. He is known for being a very loud and proud individual, yet here he is willing to personify himself as just being friends with this guy. And oftentimes Trump will try to make himself the people's people and the man's man, try to relate to the little guy. But in this instance, it's actually doing the opposite. He is talking about Charlie and he's elevating him up to the status of somebody who is of such importance that he can simply call up the president and he can make the president feel guilty for not doing something simply because he's that much of a stand-up guy, right? This is just, again, from the perspective of a eulogy, this is how you write one to show love to somebody, right? Because you're saying, this guy, he was not a politician, right? He did not hold any office. But Trump is saying, I felt bad when I didn't do what this guy asked, simply because I always knew his motives were genuine. And I always knew that he gave more than he took. And he would only ask me to do this if he thought it was for the good of me, for the good of the people. Basically, this is what all of us want to have a legacy of, right? We want to be remembered as having a legacy of giving more than we take. And typically, whenever Trump gives speeches, his main goal in his speech is to elevate himself. He'll be like, oh, nobody does anything as good as I do. I do things better than everybody else. I am the best of the best. He doesn't say that anywhere in this. Instead, he takes the attention off himself and he puts it on Charlie. And he says, I felt bad when I couldn't give Charlie what he wanted. Right? So he actually admits that there were times where he couldn't give people what he wanted. And that's usually not stuff you'll ever hear Trump say. Usually Trump tries to portray himself, and this is how most politicians are, right? They will try to portray themselves as always being able to do what people want them to do, right? It doesn't usually benefit them to act like this. But he says, I felt guilty when I couldn't give Charlie what he wanted to do, which, did he actually feel guilty? I don't know, right? I don't know the heart of the president, and I know that this speech is curated to do all these things, right? I'm just analyzing it from a rhetorical perspective. I don't know his actual heart. I don't know how he actually felt. But this is what he's communicating. And what he is communicating is elevating Charlie to such a high level that I think it's really admirable, and it's going to have a very positive impact later on whenever there's certain things that he's saying. And the things that we're going to be analyzing in a little bit are the things that I've seen people quoting in the news and throwing everywhere, and they've been taking them out of context in order to accuse Trump of being hateful and stuff like that. And they're actually missing the point of exactly what Trump is saying here. His whole point in all of this is to honor Charlie. And that's really the whole goal of the memorial service, right? And because there's this close connection between the religion and the politics and the personal and stuff like that, I think it's very easy to miss the point that is being made here. But everything he's saying here is meant to elevate Charlie and lift him up as this paragon of Christian virtue, which I think is cool. Let's move on to the next clip.
And no matter how big Charlie became, no one was too small for him to notice. He was good to everybody. Didn't matter. Several years ago, a fourth grader asked Charlie to appear on his podcast. which was probably only watched by the parents of that fourth grader. And Charlie, who was actually pretty hot at the time, to be honest, he agreed, and the boy asked for advice. Charlie replied, the left. I call it the radical left. I call it sometimes the radical left lunatics. But Charlie didn't say that. He called it the left. He was probably right, but I can't help it. I can't help it. So he said the left, radical left lunatics, may have all the money in the world, but they can never outwork me. I will wake up as early as I need to about himself. I will stay up as late as I need to, and I will never stop fighting for our country. And he did this until his dying breath. That's what he was doing. That's what he was doing. Think of it. Wow.
Okay. And so when you look at this clip, this immediately follows what we just talked about. The first thing that Trump does is he elevates Charlie, right? On one hand, he just acknowledged that Charlie is the type of guy who could just call up the president, which makes him sound very significant. He was the type of guy who could make the president feel bad when he didn't do what Charlie asked. But then on the other hand, what does he say about Charlie? He's the type of guy who will just show up on a fourth grader's podcast, right? So here you have this guy who is so important that he makes the president feel bad when the president can't do something, yet he will show up on a fourth grader's podcast. And so again, he's elevating Charlie to this really high status. And then in that same clip that we just watched, he does something which I think is really clever. And is going to pave the way for other stuff we're going to see momentarily. But he says that Charlie would always refer to the people on the opposite side of the political spectrum, the left, right? The Democrat to the liberal, right? He would just call them the left. But Trump says, I call them the radical left lunatics. And everybody laughs because the thing is, that is what Trump does do. He calls them the radical left lunatics. Even after Charlie died, whenever people first interviewed Trump, what was his first thing he did? He said, oh, it's just the radical left lunatics being like he immediately tried to divide, right? And then he goes on, and immediately after that, he says, Charlie's probably right. They're probably just the left. And he says, but I can't help calling them that. And this right here, I think, like this clip that we just watched, it gives us the key to understanding the rest of what Trump is saying here. Because what Trump just acknowledged in that moment is that he has blind spots that he cannot overcome, but Charlie was sober-minded and fair to those who were opposed to him, right? Because Trump says, I can't help myself, I called them the radical left lunatics, but he says, but at the same time, Charlie's probably right. We probably should just call him the left. And so right here, you've got the leader of the United States admitting that he is more of a divisive figure than Charlie Kirk. That is probably the greatest compliment you could give. Because again, Trump consistently presents himself as the best leader possible. He is the best of the best. Yet right here, he admittedly says, you know what? There is somebody better than me. He says, I can be polarizing and I can't help it. Right? He says that my emotions get the best of me. I'm inherently a polarizing figure who likes to draw battle lines. I like to put things in extremes to try to provoke people to anger. And I think a lot of people forget that that is what Trump's whole thing is. They think, oh man, like what is Trump doing? It's a political strategy, right? He's trying to instigate things because he's a businessman. He realizes that even bad press is good press and it draws attention to him. And so he always draws these battle lines. He always instigates. He always talks in extremes because he realizes that's how you get attention. But he says, but Charlie wasn't like that. Charlie wasn't in it just to get attention. He wasn't in it just to make it big. He wasn't in it to be a conniving businessman working his way to the top. He was simply in it to be fair and to preach truth and to love well. And so, yes, I might call them radical left lunatics, but Charlie, he just called them left, and he was probably correct. Because that's the appropriate way to approach your enemies and the people who oppose you. And that's going to be a recurring theme throughout Trump's message. He's going to continually draw attention to the fact that Trump is himself a man of extremes, and Charlie was not. And what Trump's admitting is that he had to resort to extremes to get where he's at. But Charlie, he got to where he was at, and he became this huge influential figure simply by loving people well. That's an amazing message. That's really good. And that's why I found myself so impressed by this. Because regardless of whether or not you think that Donald Trump is actually a Christian, what he is ultimately going to be preaching throughout this message is a Christian message, right? Regardless of what you think of the man, the words that are coming forth from his mouth, It's the truth. And to me, it was something where I was like, wow, this is actually going to glorify God. And yes, there are going to be polarizing things that he says. There are going to be things that are going to be misinterpreted. There are going to be times where Trump is going to be Trump and he's going to go into talks about autism and tariffs and long things, and he's going to turn it into a big political debate that really didn't have to happen. But again, that's who he is. And I think it actually serves to elevate the rest of the speech because it doesn't feel like it's just fabricated. He does still go on these long diatribes about politics because he's simply being himself. And that actually enhances the speech. Because since he feels like he is simply being himself, it actually elevates his words when he talks positively about Charlie, because he doesn't sound like a fake version of Donald Trump saying these things. No, he is just Donald Trump who is genuinely giving words of not words of affirmation. He is genuinely humbling himself to exalt somebody who he thinks was better than him. And that's really amazing. He's going to consistently do this again and again and again. And what ultimately is being promoted is Charlie's ethos, right? The ideas of loving your neighbors and loving your enemies and just forgiving those who harm against you, like having healthy dialogue, right? And to where these are all Christian virtues, and to where there's other people whose messages we could analyze that more explicitly preach the gospel. But what I think is so beautiful about Trump's speech here is that it is preaching a Christian ethos that really only makes sense in light of the actual Christian gospel. It's not simply Christian morality. It is a Christian morality that is built off of saving, it's a Christian morality that only applies in light of the gospel truth, right? Because there are other Christian principles like, anti-abortion stuff, and like whenever you get into the right, like what's right and wrong forms of marriage and certain things like that, those things are very quickly turned into political debates because they're very easy black and white answers that are found in scripture. But whenever it comes to forgiving your enemies and stuff like that, those are very difficult things to do unless you actually understand that you have been forgiven by the God of the universe, right? And the only way to actually engage in forgiveness to such an extreme as like what we see with Charlie and what we're going to see with his wife and stuff like that is if you recognize that you yourself have been forgiven. It's far easier to justify unforgiveness. And I see this in a lot of, politicians, even some of the politicians who spoke at the memorial service. They were talking more about drawing battle lines and going off to war and stuff like that. Whereas what Trump is going to be promoting here is a level of forgiveness that he himself does not feel like he can even reach yet. Right? And that's because he's elevating Charlie as somebody who genuinely understood who God was and what it looked like to have a relationship with him. So let's move on to the next one.
Through it all, the core of Charlie's message and his basic method never changed. It never really changed. He stayed the same person also. At every campus event, Charlie asked the people who disagreed with him to come forward, and instead of silencing them, he handed them a microphone and let them speak. And he'd convinced so many of them. It was a pretty amazing thing to watch, actually. Shortly before Charlie arrived on campus, the day he was assassinated, a staff member texted him that there were many critics and students who were opposed to his views, and rather strenuously in the crowd. And that actually made him feel good because he wanted to convince them. He understood. He really did. He understood what was right. And he was right about that. A lot of it was based on common sense, by the way. Charlie wrote back to the staff member saying, "I'm not here to fight them. I want to know them and love them, and I want to reach them and try and lead them into a great way of life in our country."
Okay. So here's where we start getting to the meat of what really sets Charlie apart from everybody else, right? Because the reason why Charlie was killed was because of his words, right? People did not like the message he was sharing because they found it hateful, and they charged him with bigotry and stuff. I mean, just seeing, like, Trump talks about this, we're not going to look at the clip, but there are people who have been rejoicing in light of the fact that Charlie was killed. And it's disgusting how they've responded, because you can't help but be like, well, like, this guy was actually just genuinely such a sweet and nice person. But they claim that he was being hateful because his words opposed what they believed. And ultimately, he was silenced by being put to death for his words. But Trump highlights that the very reason why Charlie was killed is the very reason why he engaged with those people to begin with, right? Where they would silence him for his beliefs, rather than him silencing them, he gave them a microphone, right? He actually wanted to engage in healthy discourse. And that is beautiful. And that actually is something that Charlie did that I think a lot of Christians need to learn from. Because I think that so often, even in Christian circles, we almost adopt a borderline, a cult-like mentality where we think that the only conversations we should ever have are with fellow people who agree with Christian beliefs and principles. And if you talk with anybody who doesn't agree with that, well, you know what? You're on the road to apostasy and stuff. But the thing is, if we are on the side of truth, we should not be afraid of questions and we should not be afraid of disagreement because we believe that as Christians, we are on the side of truth and the side of life. And therefore, it's healthy to have these discussions because maybe we can shine light into the darkness. We can overcome lies with the truth. And ultimately, we can bring people down the way of Jesus and we can lead them to him. And that's what Charlie was doing. And whenever you watch his videos, it's so cool because I've got to admit, he's better than me. Right? Because I have a tough time figuring out exactly how to navigate Christianity and politics, whereas he did it very boldly. And I guess like to me, it'd be hard for me to ever go into politics because I don't know that perfect line. Whereas he seemed like he'd spend a lot of time, working through it to where he could speak boldly about his political beliefs. But when you watch the videos of him interacting with people and stuff like that, he was very blunt and open about the fact that his political beliefs stemmed from religious convictions. I think that's really cool. Yes, he could defend those political beliefs from outside of his religious convictions as well. That's good. But one thing that I don't like is that oftentimes people will try to act like they've arrived at their political beliefs totally separate from their religious convictions. And this is something like whenever people talk about the separation of church and state, oftentimes they misunderstand what that means. They talk about the separation of church and state as if it means that the church and your opinions about God should not influence what you believe politically. And that is just ignorant, and it doesn't fully comprehend what exactly religion is. If you believe that there is a God, and you believe that there are ways to know what he wants of you and who he is and what his character is like, that should shape not only who you are, but your entire perception of reality. And so it inherently will shape your political beliefs. And one thing that I do get annoyed with sometimes is whenever there are Christians out there who refuse to acknowledge that their political beliefs come from their religious convictions. They should, right? That is where it should come from. And Charlie did a great job of that. Charlie, he would go out there and people would say, okay, well, your belief just comes from you being a Christian. And he says, well, absolutely. Yes, the Bible says it. And therefore, yeah, that's why I believe this. But he says, but there's also things outside of the Bible that would lead me to the same position so that even if you're not a Christian, I think this is the right thing for you to do. And I thought that was really, really, really well done. And I think that the way he navigated it was super positive because he didn't try to silence people. He would give them a microphone. And there's even times where people would start booing and heckling the people he's talking to. And he would silence them and say, hey guys, no, let them talk. And he was always cordial and respectful. And yes, there'd be times where he'd badger them back and forth. But that's kind of just how you talk with college students sometimes. And it's actually the better way to communicate rather than just being just emotionless. You engage with them with how they are and how they try to conduct themselves. But he was a very loving individual, and that is what Trump is highlighting here, right? There are many people who will simply try to silence people who oppose them, but Charlie Kirk was not one of those people. And in that way, I think what Trump is acknowledging is that Charlie embodied the American ideal. What we want as Americans is for people to engage in free speech, and that is exactly what Charlie was promoting. Right? He says, you want to disagree with me? I will give you a microphone and we can talk about it in front of everybody. And he says, I won't bring any notes. I won't do anything. I will simply talk with you person to person. And my goal is not to beat you. My goal is to love you and learn from you and maybe teach you as well. Right? And I think that's all very helpful. And I think that's how we as Christians should engage with the people around us. Let's move on to the next clip.
In that private moment on his dying day, we find everything we need to know about who Charlie Kirk truly was. He was a missionary with a noble spirit and a great, great purpose. He did not hate his opponents. He wanted the best for them. That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. I am sorry, Erica. But now Erica can talk to me and the whole group, and maybe they can convince me that that's not right, but I can't stand my opponent. Charlie's angry. Looking down, he's angry at me now.
This is the clip that I have seen people quoting out of context And they're saying, see, from the stage, President Trump is promoting hate and violence and not wanting the best for your opponent. And I think that this might, this is like a whole other subject that we could talk about, of how bad our culture has become about just like taking things out of context, and we just like clickbaity stuff, and we just like little clips removed from their context. But if that's the takeaway that you took from this message, then you have totally missed what Trump is doing right there. This is, to me, one of the best moments from Trump's message, because what he is doing again is highlighting his inability to be as good and gracious a man as Charlie was. He begins by stating that Charlie did not hate his opponents. He wanted what was best for them. And he promotes those as being the ideal standard. That's how we should be. We should not hate our opponents. We should want what's best for them. And this is where Trump says, you know what? He's better than me, right? He says, well, he didn't specifically say he's better than me, but he says this is where we were different. He says, I do hate my opponents and I don't want what's best for them. And some people, they take it out of context and they say that's what he's promoting. That's not what he's promoting at all. He is saying, I am not as good as Charlie. Because then he immediately follows that up and says, Erica, I'm sorry. Because remember, Erica just preached a message of forgiveness where she said that she forgives the person who shot her husband. And so he turns to Erica and says, I'm sorry. And then he even laughs and says, look at that. Charlie's looking down at me and he's angry at me. So what Trump is acknowledging here is that he is the person in the wrong. He says, you're right. I do hate my opponent and I do not want what's best for them. And he's saying that is what is wrong with me. And that's why Charlie's a better person, because Charlie embodied the character of Christ, whereas Trump is admitting that how Paul would put it is that he's responding in the flesh. And I think that's so genius, because again, I don't know what Trump's relationship with God is, right? I've got my own opinions. I don't need to share them on here. I don't know what his relationship with God is. But what I do know right here is that he is acknowledging that a Christian ethic and Christian lifestyle is superior to whatever lifestyle he's living. So if he does have a relationship with God, then Trump is acknowledging that he's a sinful person who has a lot of work to do. If he doesn't have a relationship with God, he's acknowledging he's a sinful person with a lot of stuff like work to do, right? Either way, he is positioning himself as being lesser than Charlie, and the thing that makes Charlie better than him is Charlie's Christ-likeness, right? The fact that he was willing to live like Christ even though it was hard. Right? That is exactly what Trump's point is. He's saying, I know that Charlie's mad at me for saying this, and I know I need to get over it, but I can't help but hate my enemy. And you know why? Because that is the natural response, right? Trump usually spends all of his time talking about himself as being better than everybody else and being the best of the best, and nobody does things better than me. But right here, Trump actually makes himself like every other person, because every other person naturally wants to hate their enemies. Every other person, like the worldly response, the natural response to hate is hate. Whenever somebody harms you, the natural response is vengeance. Very few people wake up in the morning and say, God, I just hope you shower my enemies with blessings. Most people do not do that, right? That is the natural response. We want to respond to evil with evil. We want to respond to hate with hate. When somebody harms us, we want vengeance. Whenever somebody is mean to us, we want to take their eye out, right? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That is what we want. And we want to take vengeance to our own hands. And in this moment, Trump identifies himself with the majority. But he says that Charlie was one of the few who was willing to go beyond that and who was willing to actually love as Christ loved. And he was willing to look his enemy in the face, and he was willing to love them rather than hate them, and he was willing to want what was best for his enemies, and that is the very reason why he talked with them. He didn't talk with them because he wanted to hate them. He talked with them because he wanted to love them, right? And that's what's so beautiful about this, right? And so people are taking this little clip and they're totally missing what Trump is doing rhetorically speaking. And to me, that really discourages me because, I think the reason I want to talk about this so much is because it's just a really well-crafted speech. And people are missing the point because they are simply harping on the political side of things. And they're saying, the president's saying this. No, if you pay attention to what the president's saying, he is actually humbling himself for one of the first times I've actually seen in a public format. And he's doing it in order to exalt this person who lived like Christ. That is something that we should genuinely be impressed by. Let's move on to the next clip.
He wasn't interested in demonizing anyone. He was interested in persuading everyone to the ideas and principles he believed were good, right, and true. Before each appearance, he prayed these words: God, use me for your will. Always said the same thing: use me for your will. And that is exactly what God did. When you think, that's exactly what he did. The more success Charlie had, and he was getting more and more successful, the more dangerous his mission became. On campuses all over the country, his quest for open dialogue was met with menacing hate.
Okay, so again, here we see Trump, and he's bringing up God a lot. He says that Charlie's praying and he wants to do God's will, and he says that God helped him do his will. And so here Trump is acknowledging the existence of God. He is saying that God was actively doing something through Charlie's life. And this is where most people are going to sit down and they're going to try to break down the motives in the heart of the president and try to figure out whether or not he genuinely means these words or whether or not he's simply saying them in order to, again, bring in the votes of all the evangelical crowd. I'm not here to answer that. I do not know the president's heart. I do not know his motives. All I can say is that the message he is preaching is a pretty good message, right? This is kind of like where Jesus is talking about, and he says, if anybody is not against me, he is for me, right? And that's whenever like the apostles came to him and they're like, hey, there's these other people who are like casting out demons in your name, but they're not amongst us. And Jesus says, okay. He says, but if they're preaching me, we're good, right? And the apostle Paul says very similar things where he says, hey, yeah, some people preach out of selfish ambition, but at least they're proclaiming the name of Christ. And of course, there are times wherever that becomes problematic. But in this instance right here, we have to realize that it is publicly well known that the president has a track record of not being the most devout individual. And so whenever people are hearing what he's saying here, he's not winning people over into thinking that he's like all of a sudden a devout Christian because he mentions God. The reason why he's mentioning God right here is because he's acknowledging that God was active in Charlie's life. And so whether or not he genuinely believes it or not, he is simply giving lip service to it. And he is acknowledging that according to Charlie's belief and according to the belief that he is espousing, the president's espousing, God did do what Charlie asked. He answered prayers and he used his will. But then if you go even further, he says that through God accomplishing his will in Charlie, persecution arose. Which is actually crazy because that basically right there, Donald J. Trump, the businessman, the really rich billionaire dude, he just demolished the prosperity gospel. Because a lot of times people will preach that if you walk in obedience to God, things will go well with you. But in the same breath that he says that God accomplished his will through Charlie, he says that Charlie's obedience to the truth led him into the line of fire and ultimately cost him his life. He's acknowledging that sometimes God's will being accomplished through you will cost you things. Was Trump thinking about the complex theology behind that? I don't know. Again, I don't even know if he wrote the actual speech that he's saying here. All I'm saying is that is the message being preached. And that is actually a more faithful message of Christianity than you hear sometimes from pulpits. And that's cool to me, right? He says that every day when Charlie went out there, all he wanted to do was do God's will. And sure enough, that is what Charlie said about himself, right? He wanted to be remembered not simply as a political advocate, but as a servant of God who was known for his courage and faith, right? And Trump says that's what he's remembered for, right? He went out there, he wanted to do God's will, and he accomplished God's will in that way, but his position for truth led him into the line of fire, and it ultimately cost him his life. And that's okay. God is still good, right? For hours, people were singing praise songs to God at this memorial service, and that's in spite of the fact that this person was killed for his beliefs, which stem from his Christian values, right? And so the prosperity gospel, it has no business in this Charlie Kirk memorial, and that's actually really, really cool, and it's really cool that the president himself is the one who's actually going against the prosperity gospel. I just found that fun. Let's go to the next clip.
They lied about him because they did not want you to listen to him or to learn from him, because what he was talking about and even preaching made so much sense. Everywhere he went, he won the debates, he won the hearts, he won the minds, and yes, he won the elections for people. He helped us, he helped other people. We won the biggest election in the history of our country, I believe. Charlie Kirk was without a doubt among the most influential figures in the most important election in the history of our country. The election of, that beautiful day, November 5th, 2024. Do you remember that day? It was 9 months ago. What a day that was.
So in that clip right there, what Trump does at the beginning, I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, but he actually compares Charlie to Jesus, right? Because Jesus, the reason why he was killed is because the words of truth that he preached threatened the people in power, and it went against the things that they believed, right? In Jesus, he said it in grace and love and kindness, but at times he rebuked them, and at times he got onto them, and he was unashamed to speak the truth in love. And as a result, people killed him for it. And Trump says, well, that's basically what happened to Charlie. He doesn't say that this is like Jesus, but he says that he went out there speaking the truth in love. He doesn't use that exact language, but that's what he's communicating. And ultimately, people didn't like it because it convicted them of sin. And it convicted them that they were doing the wrong thing, and therefore they silenced him. But then he goes on, and he does another thing that Trump will very rarely do. He gives credit to somebody else. And he says, Charlie Kirk is responsible for winning elections. And this is something that a lot of people, they've begun to acknowledge it lately. But if it were not for Charlie Kirk, it's very possible that Trump would not be president right now. And as much as Trump might go around often speaking about how he's the best of the best and everything, like everything like pales in comparison to his own accomplishments, right here he acknowledges that they won the election largely due to Charlie Kirk. And we're not going to look at the clip in this because it's not one of the clips that I chose. But he goes on to recount how on the election night, whenever they won, it's actually a really cool video if you go look it up, Charlie was overcome with emotion. And the reason I didn't include the clip is because I think Trump actually misquoted Charlie a little bit. It's been a while since I've actually seen the clip. But whenever they won the election, Charlie was overcome with emotion. He begins to cry. And after a while, when he can finally speak, he just says, "This is God's mercy on our nation." And to me, it's such a moving moment because, again, I'm not somebody who's actively involved in politics. I actually don't put as much weight into politics as a lot of people do because ultimately I think that all human governments are destined to fail. And ultimately, there's just going to be corruption, right? And so I want to vote. I want to be actively engaged in politics. But to me, I don't put as much weight into it as many people do. But Charlie, who was actively involved in the political scheme or in the political world, whenever Trump won, his first reaction was not, "Look at what I have accomplished through all of my hard effort." He simply said, "This is God's mercy on our nation." And even if you don't agree with what he's saying, I'm not saying what he said is right. I'm not saying what he's saying is wrong. I'm simply saying that lets you know what Charlie viewed himself as doing, right? He was simply, it was almost like David after his sin with Bathsheba, when he's crying out to God, praying for mercy. And then ultimately, in David's case, God did not show mercy, and David's son with Bathsheba died, and then David got up and praised the Lord. But in the case with Trump winning, Charlie started weeping, and he realized that all of his efforts had not been in vain, but he doesn't use it to praise himself. Instead, he uses it to cry out and say, "Thank you, God, for being merciful to us." That says a lot about his character, right? And that is what Trump is acknowledging. He says, yeah, he helped us win the election. Trump usually will give himself the glory for that, but in this moment, he actually gives glory to Charlie, and Charlie gave glory to God. And so whenever you look at all this, it's actually a really profound message. And that's why whenever I was watching it, I couldn't help but be impressed, because I was like, I just analyzed everything. And I was like, this is actually a really powerful message if you sit down and just break it down from beginning to end. Next clip.
Every single American should take a long, hard look at the twisted soul and dark spirit of anyone who would want to kill a young man as good as Charlie. To kill anybody, but to kill a man like this, he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve this. Our country didn't deserve this. And anyone who would make excuses for it are just out of their mind. Charlie's murder was not just an attack on one man or one movement. It was an attack on our entire nation. That was a horrible attack on the United States of America. It was an assault on our most sacred liberties and God-given rights. The gun was pointed at him, but the bullet was aimed at all of us. That bullet was aimed at every one of us. Indeed, Charlie was killed for expressing the very ideas that virtually everyone in this arena and most other places throughout our country deeply believed in. But the assassin failed in his quest because Charlie's message has not been silenced. It now is bigger and better and stronger than ever before, and it's not even close.
So There, at the very end, Trump does what he does best, and he says things are bigger and better and stronger than ever before. And usually those are things that he uses to describe his own impact, but he does it to describe Charlie's, which is so cool. Because again, these are just the classic things that Trump is known for, yet he's doing it to exalt not himself, but somebody else. That to me is just so impressive because I never see this side of Trump, and I just think it's really cool. And again, he's a good speaker. He knows what he's doing. This is all very intentional. But the significance of this clip to me is that this is what a president is meant to do, right? Because on one hand, he is calling out evil, right? And he says that nobody should have this done that Charlie had done to him. That's just not acceptable. It's not what we should promote. Americans should not be happy that this happened. It is an evil, evil thing. People should not lose their lives for promoting free speech, and that's bad. But at the same time, he doesn't go as far as drawing dividing lines as he would normally, right? I mean, literally right after Charlie was killed, he did begin to draw the radical lines, right? But in this instance, he doesn't. Instead, he just says, this should be a moment of unity, right? And this should draw us together because we should all agree that this is bad. And to me, I think it's interesting whenever you compare and contrast how he responded immediately after Charlie's death to this moment, because it lets us know what his goals are here, right? In the moment after Charlie's death, Trump was responding how Trump always responds, right? He was simply responding as a politician. But in this moment right here, he is doing what you do in a eulogy. And he is trying to not promote his own beliefs, but he's trying to promote the beliefs of the person who has been silenced. And he's trying to promote the beliefs of Charlie. And he says, yeah, this is not acceptable. And Charlie would agree with that. And so Trump says this should never happen. We are a country that should stand for free speech. And ultimately, what he does by the end of this is that Trump says that through Charlie's sacrifice, things will be better than ever. And so ultimately, the side that, like the people that killed him, or the person that killed him, failed, right? They were trying to silence hate. Well, actually, I guess they didn't fail. They were trying to silence hate. And in a way, they did silence hate because they actually helped unify people, like a lot of people, in the fact that this was wrong. Yes, there are those detractors who are going to rejoice. They're going to dance on his grave, and that is disgusting. And Trump already talked about that. We didn't look at the clip, but he already talked about that in the speech. But ultimately, the efforts of evil have failed. And we haven't seen the long-term effects of this and stuff like that. And so to me, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in our nation as a result of this. But so far, the response has been largely positive. Yes, on social media, there's negativity, but that's because social media is honestly a very terrifying place to be. But by and large, the way that people have responded is a very positive way. And that's what Trump is highlighting. He says that, yes, Charlie was taken out, but the message he preached has become bigger and better and stronger than ever before. And so ultimately, those people who were trying to silence him made him sing even louder. And that's it. To me, that reminds me of whenever Jesus is going in for the triumphal entry and the religious leaders come to him and they say, silence your disciples. And he says, I tell you the truth, if they were silent, even the stones themselves would cry out. But in this instance, it's Charlie who was silenced. And now the people who are, who believe in his message are now going out and proclaiming it louder. And again, the reason why this is so cool is because Charlie was so unashamedly Christian. My fear through all of this is that people will turn Charlie Kirk into an idol and they will make it all about Charlie, 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 Charlie. And I don't want that to happen. I don't think Charlie would want that to happen. And so that's where I'm very hesitant to see where things go from here. But to me, there is a large faction of things. And what we saw during this memorial service is that for every mention of Charlie that there were almost like 2 or 3 mentions of God. And to me, that's encouraging because hopefully that is the message people take away from it. Sure, there are plenty of people who are not Christians and they might stand for what Charlie stood for and therefore they will idolize him more. But I'm talking about those within the Christian community or those people who are interested in Christianity or who appreciated Charlie's values and want to see where he got them from. I'm hoping they get the right message from this and ultimately they learn to seek God throughout all this. Like that's my ultimate goal. And I think that's what Charlie's goal would be too. And so again, I just like everything that Trump is saying here because it ultimately is serving the purpose of honoring his friend and ultimately glorifying God, which I just think is it's not what I was expecting. So let's go to the next clip.
As you know, the depraved assassin who planned and executed Charlie's killing has been arrested and charged with capital murder. God willing, he will receive the full and ultimate punishment for his horrific crime. It's a terrible thing. Because you can't let that happen. You can't let that happen.
Here, Trump does something which I imagine some people might not like, but I would contest. And this is not because I'm a Trump fanboy, because believe me, I'm not just a Trump fanboy. I've got a complex opinion on Trump, like probably most people do. But what Trump is doing here, I would say, is the proper response from a government official. He is seeking justice. And he says that this guy should get what is coming for him. And ultimately what that's going to look like, only time will tell, right? I know that they are pursuing the death penalty. And people have different complex opinions about the death penalty. I think that the Bible makes a good case that the death penalty is a legitimate possibility and maybe even a responsibility for the government. But at the same time, it's a complex scenario, right? Some people would see, they would see Trump's words here as contradicting Erica's words from previously, right? Erica said, I forgive this man, and now Trump says he will get justice. And ultimately what Trump is suggesting is the death penalty. Some people might view those as contradictory, but they're not contradictory, right? Jesus makes it clear that our goal should be, not eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but to turn the other cheek, right? We should forgive people, and we should forgive those who sin against us as God himself has forgiven us, right? That is what Erica did, and that is ultimately what we should all do to people who personally sin against us. However, the responsibilities of a government are to enact justice. And should they decide to enact grace, that is possible, right? But we do have to realize that that's basically what the judicial process is there for, right? They have to assess the situation and they have to figure out what the fitting punishment would be, right? There should not be cruel and unusual punishment, right? The punishment should not exceed the crime, but justice is the goal of the government, right? If we were in an inherently Christian government, and if America was an inherently Christian nation, well, then I would say, you know what? Maybe we do need to go above and beyond, and we do need to be gracious and merciful to all people. But the thing is, America is not an inherently Christian government, right? What I would do as a Christian is not inherently what I can impose on the government itself, right? And so the government's job is to enact justice, and if they want to show mercy, they can. But even then, it gets more complex because you have to figure out what does mercy look like in that scenario, right? In some cases, the death penalty might actually be more merciful, right? I don't have the answers for all this. That's why I'm not in politics. What I'm just highlighting here is that these things do not disagree with one another, and what Trump is saying here is actually what you should want from a government official, right? The prophets in the Old Testament, they're constantly confronting the leaders of Judah and Israel, and they're saying, why are you being so unjust? Right? Why are you not punishing people for their crimes? And why are you exalting people for being terrible people? You could argue that they're being gracious and merciful. But to the Old Testament prophets, they said, no, that is injustice. Your job as a government official is to bring about justice in the land. And whenever justice is ignored, wickedness abounds. Right? And so we've got to realize that this is a delicate and careful balance that has to be navigated here. And that's why I'm saying I don't have all the answers. But I am saying that the biblical perspective is that the government exists to bring about justice. But in personal matters, our job is to overrule justice with grace. Right? And if somebody personally harms me, my job is to forgive them. Right? And that's exactly what Erica Kirk did. I can't wait to talk about that because she just did fantastic. But right here, what Trump is doing is what a president should do. He's acknowledging that a grievous evil has been committed and there should be some form of punishment. What that looks like, only time will tell. But what he's saying is that they are going to do what a government should do, and they are bringing about justice. It is not going to be overlooked, right? So let's move on to the next clip.
No side in American politics has a monopoly on disturbed or misguided people. But there's one part of our political community which believes they have a monopoly on truth, goodness, and virtue, and concludes they have also a monopoly on power, thought, and speech. Well, that's not happening anymore. We've turned that corner very quickly. Tragically, atrocities of this kind, and kind that we saw in Utah, of all places, are the eventual consequence of that kind of thinking. If speech is violence, then some are bound to conclude that violence is justified to stop speech. And we're not going to let that be justified.
At the very beginning of that clip, Trump did something which I think people might be tempted to overlook because of what he went on to say afterwards. But at the very beginning, what he says is that no side has their monopoly on crazy and deluded and extreme individuals. And those are very powerful words coming from Trump, because Trump, again, he is inherently a more polarizing figure, and he likes drawing battle lines, and he likes portraying the enemy and the opposite side as being the embodiment of evil. But he begins that entire clip by saying, no side has a monopoly, right? He says, whether you're left, right, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, no matter what side you're on, there are going to be crazy extremists on both sides. And that's a good thing to acknowledge, right? So right there, he is pursuing unity. He's saying, what happened here? He's saying, I'm not saying that this one guy who did this thing embodies the entire Democratic Party. And I'm not saying that the Republican Party is like absent of any radical individuals as well. He's saying that what happened here should not be tolerated. And whenever one side promotes certain values, we have to realize that eventually it's going to lead to radical things like this. And sure, both sides might be responsible for leading to radicals, extremes like this, but in this instance, what he's addressing is the fact that free speech is at stake, and that's what's so scary about the situation. And to me, this actually highlights why the Charlie Kirk situation is so shocking. Because I've been talking with a lot of my friends and stuff about this, because again, this Charlie Kirk stuff, it's pretty crazy to me, because his death has impacted me more than it had, like a lot of other people's deaths have. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And most Christians that I've talked to, they've been shocked for a different reason than I have. And that's because most of them have been, like, I've heard them saying, well, he believed everything that I believe, and so if they're coming after him, they can come after me as well. And to me, they've been shocked about the idea of like martyrdom or something like that. And that's not why this was shocking to me, because to me, whenever I read the Bible, I've always read that persecution and martyrdom is always a possibility. And whenever Jesus lays down the call to discipleship, from the very beginning, he makes it clear, if you are not willing to pick up your cross and follow, you are not worthy to be one of my disciples. That's simply how he puts it. And so, to me, I live my life daily aware of the fact that it is possible that one day this could lead to martyrdom. I don't know if it's going to, right? We live in America, and in general, there's freedom of religion, and so this stuff shouldn't happen. But it's possible, and I try to live my life in light of that. And so, to me, it isn't the martyrdom aspect of Charlie Kirk's thing that shocks me so much. Instead, it's more the implications of what this might say about our nation, right? Because our nation was founded on free speech, and the notion of it. And the fact that this guy was genuinely, he wasn't an extreme individual, he was genuinely a pretty loving guy, and yet it still happened to him. To me, it says something very shocking about where our nation is at right now. And then there's other things I think that I've been reflecting on as well. I don't really know exactly how to put it into words yet. But to me, it's not the martyrdom aspect, right? Everybody's being like, oh, like he was martyred. This is crazy. It is crazy, but I'm also aware of the fact that there are Christians martyred every single day in other parts of the world. And so I don't want to say that this is like unique. No, there's a lot of people who are martyred. But this is the first time in recent history where something to this extreme level has taken place in America, right? And then I think other things that escalate this all is the fact that he was such a public figure and that it was so well documented. And I remember like I saw like the video of his death like right after it happened. I was like, oh wow, can't unsee that. And all of that stuff, when you add it together, I think that's why this has been such a significant like cultural moment, because even back in the 60s, whenever JFK or MLK were assassinated, there's footage of it, but this guy like he was such a well-documented individual. We live in a technological age when everything's being recorded. And even whenever you see the moments leading up to his death, you see like dozens of people with phones in their hands watching this one moment. And I think that's why it's so shocking. And because in many ways, like Trump alluded to this earlier, though the gun was pointed at Charlie, it was really pointed at the American people. And yes, I would call Charlie a Christian martyr, because whether he was killed for his religious beliefs or political beliefs, his political beliefs were so tied to his religious beliefs that I think it counts as martyrdom. Because if not, you would have to say that people like Stephen, or even James, the brother of Jesus and stuff, when you look at tradition, you would have to say that they weren't martyred, or John the Baptist, right? So it's still martyrdom. But to me, the thing that sticks out more is just what this might imply about the future of America as a nation. And I'm interested to see how the church responds to that, because I know a lot of Christians who they view it as their God-given responsibility and God-given right to have freedom of religion, and they will fight for that freedom unto death. And I don't know how to respond to that, because to me, freedom of religion is not something we are promised in Scripture, right? And so to me, whenever I look at like the Apostle Paul's letters, he says to submit to the authorities when the people in charge are the Romans. And it's like Nero, who's the emperor, and he's like lighting Christians on fire and hanging them up in the alleyways to light the alleys at nighttime. And to me, that would suggest to us that we are not merely called to submit to authorities when it goes well for us. We're called to submit to authorities even if it leads to our deaths. And so freedom of religion is not something we can take for granted. But the reason why this Charlie Kirk thing has been so shocking to me is because it makes me intrigued to see how the church is going to respond. Are we going to respond like Erica, and are we going to forgive? Are we going to lift up arms and fight back? Are we going to submit to the authorities even if eventually this just turns into a whole thing where our freedom is taken away from us? I don't know. I don't know. I just know our job is to forgive and to love and to follow in the way of Jesus, which might include picking up our crosses and following him. And to me, that's very intriguing. And I just, the whole discussion to me is fascinating. And just the speech that Trump was giving here made me think of it even more. I've only got a few more clips. Let's look at the next one.
It should be no surprise that Charlie, who spent his life speaking with the critics of these traditions, ultimately became convinced that we needed not just a political realignment, but also a spiritual reawakening. We did. And we have to bring back religion to America, because without borders, law and order, and religion, you really don't have a country anymore. We want religion brought back to America. We want to bring God back into our beautiful USA like never before. We want God back.
There are 2 points that Trump makes here. One of them is about Charlie, and one of them is about himself. So on Charlie's side of things, Trump makes a point that I think that Charlie would 100% agree with, right? The thing that we need most is not a political reformation, but a spiritual awakening. And I think that's something that all Christians, including myself, would agree about. The danger of this actually kind of leads into what Trump is about to say, is my fear is that we will return to some level of cultural Christianity, which I think still exists in America today. I think it existed a little bit more back like a few decades ago, especially in like the 50s and 60s. But, well, let me address what Trump's going to say before I share the rest of my thoughts. Trump goes on to say, what we need is more religion and borders and law in America. And on one hand, I agree with him, because I think that usually nations thrive more whenever they have a unified cause, and there is no more unifying cause than religion. And so from a pragmatic perspective, I agree with what Trump is saying. And then from a political perspective, I get why he's saying this, right? Because this is what people want to hear. They're at a memorial service for a guy who was very deeply religious, and so it makes sense for him to call for religion, and obviously he got applause for everything he was saying. At the same time, though, this is where I do start getting nervous, because I think what Charlie probably wanted is different than what Trump probably means. And I think that's fine. Because again, Charlie was a Christian first and foremost, involved in politics, whereas I think that Trump is a politician first and foremost who delves into religion, right? And so that's an important distinction, because to me, my concern is the whole cultural Christianity of things. I think that there is no greater danger to the Christian church than whenever our religion and our culture become so blended together that you don't know who are genuine followers of Jesus. Right. And I think that in many ways, America has been like that for a long time period. And this might sound very controversial, but I'm glad we're moving away from that a little bit. Because to me, whenever going to church on Sundays and Wednesdays is just a cultural habit you learn from your parents, and it's not a personal choice that you are choosing to make every single week, there's a danger to that. On one hand, it's really good. Your parents should disciple you. And as a parent, it's your responsibility to implant these beliefs into your children. But there still does need to be a personal level of devotion, and going to church and believing in God. Those can't simply be habitual activities where you think that you have a relationship with God simply because you do the right things and you check off the right boxes. And I think in America, that is how Christianity has been treated more or less for a lot of our history. Right? To where a lot of people will say, oh, like, how do I know I'm a Christian? Well, I don't know. I prayed a prayer when I was 5 years old. Or I've gone to church every Sunday, right? Or I don't even go to church anymore, but I went to church when I was young, so I guess I'm a Christian. Or, oh, well, I mean, I know there's a lot of people like this in my own family, right? And you probably know people like this in your family. But their main religious convictions are only those things which equate to political talking points, right? I know plenty of people who they will not ever come to church. They will not ever read their Bibles. They do not really have a relationship with God. But the moment you start bringing up something that might be inherently political, they will all of a sudden start quoting Leviticus and Deuteronomy, even though they don't know the context. They'll start quoting all these verses just because they're political talking points. To me, that is dangerous, right? Because I don't think we should ever equate religion to politics or religion to culture, and we should not embrace cultural Christianity, right? Our faith has to inherently and always be an act of devotion, right? Both individually and communally as a church. That being said, I do think, and I think Charlie would agree, that we do need a spiritual awakening. But that spiritual awakening cannot simply be, oh, politicians need to talk more about religion. No, there need to be politicians who genuinely are living for God. And there need to be people in the general public who are genuinely living for God, and they're painting a portrait of what actual discipleship looks like. That's what we need. We need people to actually seek God, not simply people who embrace a Christian ethos and who live morally righteous lives. That stuff is good. We want righteous and moral people, but true righteousness is only attained through true devotion to God. And that's what we really ultimately need. And I think that's what Charlie was ultimately getting at, right? He wanted people, like, whenever you hear him talking, he would outright preach the gospel, right? He would admit, I'm a sinner. I need a savior. I can't do any of this stuff on my own. Yes, these are where my values come from, but you got to understand my underlying value is that I need Jesus. That's what we need people to recognize, right? We don't simply want people to start going to church in order that they can know what to believe politically. We want people to be involved with the church because they are part of the church, right? They are people who are in need of a savior, and they want to be part of the living temple of Christ Jesus, going out as a light shining in the darkness. That's ultimately what we need, and I think that's ultimately what Charlie wanted. And I think, if I'm being entirely honest, that is what the net result of this memorial service will begin to produce, because that's what I was so impressed by with the politicians. Because normally, like I said, when politicians talk about religion, I always have an air of skepticism about it. And I saw some of that at the memorial service. But more often than that, I actually saw politicians who, for the first time ever, were actually emboldened in their faith. And they were actually preaching the gospel publicly in front of everybody. And to me, that was impressive, right? They were not doing it just for a vote. They were not doing it just because it was the smart, pragmatic thing to do. In many ways, I saw politicians who, as best I can discern, were doing it because they were emboldened by Charlie's faith. And they realized that all because you're a Christian who loves your country doesn't mean you have to be a Christian nationalist. Instead, you can simply be a Christian who is doing your best to live for the kingdom of God while also being in the kingdom of the world, right? You are being in the world, but not of it. And that's why I was so encouraged by everything that I saw at this memorial service. All right, I got 2 more clips for you. Clip number 12.
Today, Charlie Kirk rests in glory in heaven for all eternity. He has gone from speaking on campuses in Wisconsin to kneeling at the throne of God, where he is right now. We grieve for the friend and leader that we have lost, but we go forward strengthened by his faith and bolstered by his courage and inspired by his example to defend the country he lived for the freedoms he died for, and the values in which he so deeply believed. He believed in values that we should all believe in.
Again, I do not know what Trump's faith life looks like. I do not know whether he believes this stuff. I don't know if he's simply reading off the teleprompter. I don't know. All I do know is that in that moment, in that clip you just saw, he looked at everybody and he proclaimed that because of his belief in Christ, Charlie is now in the presence of God, and that he's right there. He did not say, well, according to what Charlie believed. He said, no, he is there right now. And here you've got the President of the United States, one of the most popular people, if not the most popular person in the world. He is proclaiming in the presence of hundreds of thousands and hundreds of millions, if you go online, he is proclaiming that because of this man's faith in God and his willingness to follow that faith even unto death, now he is in the presence of God Almighty at the throne of God, and he is in a far better place than he was before. Before he was, he was preaching on college campuses, which is really cool. And he was talking about on college campuses to a bunch of people who didn't like him. but now he is in the presence of God, which is a far better place to be. And this is coming from the President of the United States. Does he believe it? I don't know. I don't know his heart. I don't know his motives, right? I think God can work through anybody. And I know that even if Trump was outright against God, God can still use him to accomplish his purposes. All you have to do is go look at the Babylonians and the Assyrians in the Old Testament, right? God can use whoever he wants to accomplish his purposes. And I think that's what we see right here, right? Trump just said, if you follow Jesus unto death, you will be in the presence of God. And then what does he do? He goes on and he says, and he has left behind a bunch of people who are going to go and do the same. And so as Trump reaches the end of his message, he is encouraging people to go out and be disciples like Charlie. I think that's really cool. And I was really encouraged by that. Final clip.
So, Charlie, we all want to thank you. We want to say a very loud God bless you, Charlie. God bless you for what you've done is incredible. And God bless Erica and the children. God bless the United States of America. And could I ask Erica, please come out. Erica, please come out. Thank you.
So after that right there, Erica comes out and she hugs Trump. And this is where my wife acknowledged. She was like, oh, they must have been close, because I can't imagine anybody, even if you're a grieving widow, I can't imagine somebody just walking up to the president and just hugging him like that unless y'all actually were close, which I think it's a fair point. But the way this ends is just Trump saying, thank you, Charlie. And that's how I would like to end this as well, because I really didn't follow Charlie a whole lot prior to his death. I mean, I watched plenty of his videos and stuff like that, but I wasn't like I know some of my own students and other people a little bit younger than me who followed him a lot. I was aware of him. I'd watched some of his stuff. I was always impressed by him, but I don't think I ever understood, I was more aware of him from a political perspective. I didn't really know how ingrained his faith was to his politics. I think I'd seen some of that, but not to the degree that I'm aware of now. And what was accomplished at the memorial service to me is so intriguing, right? I don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. I pray that they take root. But to me, I wanted to talk about Trump's response right here, because to me, it was just so intriguing. And I still have more I want to reflect on, because again, I realize that speeches like this are curated to a T and every word is chosen purposefully. Like, I'm not ignorant to all that stuff. And so I'm sure that there might have been political agendas behind all of this. But I'm not focused on the motives behind it. I'm simply focused on the message that was shared. And here we have a president who humbled himself. A president who is known for being proud, who willfully humbled himself to exalt a man who lived out a Christian lifestyle and who was martyred for his Christian faith and who loved his enemies and forgave those who persecuted him, and who actually encouraged free speech and open dialogue with people who outright hated him. And the president actually encourages people to go and do the same. That's the gospel, right? That's amazing. And the cool thing is that was simply the final speech. If you look at the messages like prior to that, you've got pastors and apologists and widows who are going out there and they're proclaiming the gospel even more directly, right? You've got Frank Turk going out there and he is explaining exactly what the evidence for the faith is and what it means to be saved. You've got Charlie's own pastor going out there and doing the same thing. You've got Erica getting up there and she is embodying the gospel by forgiving the person who killed her husband. This is amazing, right? And so to me, I want to reflect on this because I find it so fascinating. And I don't even know how well this video is going to do. I don't know if anybody's going to watch it. I just simply wanted to talk about it to see if we could get more people talking about it. Because, again, I have varied opinions about Trump, and I don't really feel a strong desire to make all my political opinions known. My main goal is, from a pastoral perspective, to figure out what it looks like to live for Christ faithfully. And Trump's speech, as I was listening to it, I just couldn't help but be impressed. Because regardless of what his own motives were, regardless of what his own agenda was, the message that was preached is that we all need to be more like Christ. And the greatest lesson we can learn from Charlie is not to exalt Charlie, but to exalt the one who saved Charlie. I think that's a really cool message, and that's the one I wanted to share with y'all. So thank you so much for watching this video. My name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. If you want me to do more videos inspired by this memorial service, let me know. Because I really want to reflect on it because I was just genuinely impressed by it the whole time I was watching it. Anyways, that's all I've got to say. Thank y'all so much for watching this. Hope to talk to y'all in the comments. See y'all later. Maranatha.